Bhupati sir, are you ready? Shall we start, sir?
Yes, Anna, we can start. I'm ready.
Very good morning to everyone who have come to participate in this webinar. Sir, Tyara College, Department of English, under the aegis of IQAC, we happy to present the webinar on from individual self to collective identity, reflections on the contemporary forms of life narratives. So, this is indeed a great movement. Virtually, we have assembled to think on the multiple forms that are available in life narratives. Earlier, it was known as autobiography or autobiographical, whatever a writer decided to write about himself or herself, that carried only the essential part of their life, when they born, how they were brought up, and other stuffs. But the development that has taken over demanded many features of individual record. It must have the identity recorded. It should also contain the struggle faced by the individual. Not only that, how that individual is shaped, how the society to which he or she belong is contributed to that shaping. Individual or the identity is at stake, that has been dealt in detail in the present form of life narrative. So earlier it was individual, but now it is known as collective. Collective in the sense you can find the traces of society and political agenda and the problem faced by the individual and the section to which he or she belong, how they are suppressed or put to torture. This much of details must be there when we call particular thing as life narrative. Earlier it was only prosaic. Now life narrative must have the generic perception of novel, biography, and historical writings. Such segments should also be there when something must be treated like life narrative. So these are the things we are going to ponder. We have eminent speaker, Dr. P. Bhupati from Tiruvarur Central University. He has accepted our invitation and he has come to share his views in detail about the topic that we have discussed now. I take pride in inviting Dr. Tyarajan sir, convener and the head of the Department of English, Sir Tyara College, to present welcome address. Sir, please.
Good morning, participants. We, the Department of English and the IQAC of Sir Tyara College, Chennai, is happy to present this one-day webinar on From Individual Self to Collective Identity, the reflections on the contemporary forms of life narrative. I am also happy to welcome our Secretary and Correspondent, P. Kumaraswamy, and our Dynamic Principal, Dr. P. Sanjay Kumar. I welcome today's guest speaker, Dr. P. Bhupati, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Central University of Tiruvarur, Tamil Nadu, for this seminar. Sir, I am really happy, and on behalf of English Department for TRI College, for accepting our invitation and looking forward to listening your lecture on the above set topic. I also welcome Dr. Rajesh Siman, IQAC coordinator of TRI College, Chennai. I am delighted to welcome the host of this webinar by Mr. Mahendran and coordinator N. Subhashini. I welcome our department colleagues, Dr. M. Anandaraj, Mrs. Sri Kavita, Dr. K. Jayanti, and Mrs. Kaipariya. I welcome all the participants from various departments, from various colleges, inside and out of state for this seminar. I once again welcome all of you for this seminar, and collectively we are looking forward to listening to the guest speaker on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for presenting a vivid and inspiring welcome address. Now, I feel very happy to invite Dr. Anandaraj sir, Associate Professor, Department of English, Satyara College, to introduce the guest today. Sir, please.
Good morning to all. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible. Sir.
I am happy to welcome and introduce Professor Dr. Bhupati to our program today. Dr. Bhupati is an assistant professor in the Department of English Studies, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, Central University, Tiruvallur. His research interests include disability studies, Palestine and West Asian literature, post-colonial and resistance literature, and life writing studies. For his doctoral research, he has completed his research in EFL University, Hyderabad, and he has studied identity constructions of Palestinians in the life narratives written by Palestinian refugees themselves. Before that, he was working in CUTN, and he has also taught in Aligarh Muslim University for some few years, and he has published widely articles in national and international journals, and he has edited books also in his research area. He has presented research papers in various conferences, both in India and abroad, and his research works have been published by renowned famous international publishers like Peter Lang and Routledge and Routledge Journal of Life Writing. And another important thing is that he is one of the very few scholars who has worked in the area of disability studies in India. He introduced a very specialized course titled Disability Studies for the students of MA English Literature. And he is a member in editorial review board of International Journal of Homeschooling, published by University of Michigan Press. On seeing his bio note, I am impressed by certain things. I think I can say it now. Regarding his research studies, he is a very important scholar because his research areas are very important and sensitive, like in the fields of study like Palestine and West Asian literature, where it is full of freedom struggles and identity crisis. So only a committed scholar, reader can only concentrate on these, concentrate and focus on these areas of study. So I expect, like other participants, certain basics from legends like Edward Said and Homi Bhabha from his speech, And I am suddenly reminded of one of the famous Portugal film director Pedro Costa, because he has said that he has researched on life narratives written by Palestinian refugees. In his films, the refugees from Portugal, I mean African refugees who come and settle in Lisbon, they are made into actors in his films. So I think there is a bridge between reality and fiction in his films. I think the same can be seen in the writings of Palestinian refugees. So now I welcome Professor Bhupati to give an explosive speech on the topic. Professor.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, sir. You are audible. You can go on, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Anandaraj sir, for introducing the speaker today. Over to you, Bhupati sir.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone. And at the outset, thanks to the principal, Tyagaraja College, the head department of English, and my friend Dr. Ivan Mahendran, assistant professor, department of English, Tyagaraja College, for inviting me to talk on this topic. Also for Anandaraj, Dr. Anandaraj, for his very generous introduction. I hope I would live up to this expectation. Right. So. Uh, yeah, as my title has already been read out, so I would be today talking to you about the the journey of the self. First, my talk today is actually divided into three phases. The first phase, I would be outlining you the history of the journey of the self from antiquity till present. And the second part of my talk, I would be talking to you about various forms of life narratives, like how the journey of the self started from individuality or asserting individual self to that of a collective identity, particularly after 1980s. I would actually brief you of the historical development and the socio-political, cultural, and economic backdrop which actually led to such a unprecedented development in documenting the self in the field of life writings, right? And that is to say, through such a process, how the genre, or shall we say, I think we should to now call it as the canon of life writing, has been heavily politicized, categorized, and above all, institutionalized into the academic realm of literature. Right? So now, life writing is not a concern only of literary students of literature or scholars of literature. It is also a concern of scholars of social science. The social scientists are also looking at life writings because life writings offer a very, very important, prominent understanding of the society. And in fact, the historians, for example, people like A.R. Venkatachalamurthy in South, and late M.S.S. Pondian and Hayden, were quite a number of historians across the globe. They use life writings to document the history. Right? So how such a shift actually, in a way, occurred quite radically, shall we say, after 1980s. I'll be talking to you about this particular thing. In fact, that's a concern of my talk today in my second phase. And in the third phase, after the self is getting politicized, how the self, in a way, is embedded in certain theoretical prepositions, certain theoretical categories, shall we say, certain philosophical categories, like, for example, embodiment, experience, space, and more importantly, memory. Right? So, how, in a way, the second phase, that is politicizing of the self, which in turn, in a way, attributing to the collective identity, transgresses to the third phase of my talk, that is, taking substance from embodiment, experience, memory, and space. Right? And with that, I would be, in a way, leaving you with certain, understanding of, I wouldn't say an exhaustive understanding, at least a preliminary understanding that would enable you to walk into the field of life writing or life narratives with certain amount of critical insights. Right? So that's is the contour of my talk today. Right? To begin with, so documenting self, because documenting life, in a way, looking at in a political or cultural context, emerged only after shall we say, only in the beginning of 20th century with Virginia Woolf. Right? So, but documenting the self, as in, what is the self? What is one's own? What we call it in philosophy as selfhood. You know, the ontological presence of the self. In fact, began with Augustine's Confessions. Right? Augustine's Confession. Uh, yeah, Augustine's Confession. Besides its, uh, you know, spiritual, religious, and above all, divine ponderance, you know, looks at self, you know, something which has certain meaning. In a way, the origin of documenting oneself is always traced back to Augustine's Confessions by scholars of life writings. Why? Because, you know, as I said, apart from, you know, ruminating on the concept of, let's say, pondering on the idea of spirituality, the reflection of self in the spiritual realm, reflection of self in the divine association or attribution, Augustine tried to look at himself. In other words, for the first time in the history of human race, or shall we say, in the history of writings, right? Because that's a time when even literature was not institutionalized. Literature was institutionalized or was called as a different, separate discipline only in the second half of 19th century. That's a different digression, but you know, but that's why I'm very carefully using the word writing in the history of writing. It can be a philosophical writing, it can be a historical writing, you know, it can be anything, or even what you call it, a literary writing. Right? So, for the first time in the history of writing, somebody tried to see himself, tried to think about himself through his own writing. Because if you could go through Augustine's Confessions, you'd be you know, able to understand how Augustine looks at his own self, how he in a way thinks about his own self, and in other words, how he thinks through spirituality, divine attribution, and religious connotations about the idea of self. Right? I think that's a very, very, in a way, radical, in a way, inaugural understanding of the self, which is manifesting in terms of spirituality, in terms of divinity, because that's a time when the divine, you know, attributions were more in numbers. So we know like the Greek tragedy and how it actually emerged, the idea of, you know, Greek people enjoying only the tragedy, why actually it emerged all these things. Right? But it is in this context, you know, Augustine, in a way, was pondering over the idea of self. Who is he? I think that's a very, very important thing. And the idea of who is he, the question of who is he, was time and again historically onset. If you look at even Descartes' notion of I, and even the Enlightenment notion of you know, looking at the self, the very idea of enlightenment itself quite interestingly constructed on getting into the answer, or let's say interrogating, you know, the question of who is somebody, who am I, you know. So Augustine asked the question, who am I? Am I alone, or I'm somebody who is in a way associated, or who is part of the spirituality, or who is part of the existence, or who is part of the ontology of divine presence. Right? Finally, Augustine, somebody who actually arrives at this sort of a conclusion that he is somebody who is indeed a part of divine existence, who is indeed in a way an integral part of divinity, an integral part of God. That's altogether a different thing. But later, that sort of a theorization was challenged by Rousseau in his Confession. Right? So, with that, I'm actually moving into the the inaugural, shall we say, the Enlightenment thinker Descartes. Right? So Descartes' notion of self is known to everyone. By taking a cue from what was already in existence in the field of philosophy, of the idea of the self, Descartes tried to distinguish thinking I from the existent I. Right? So because as we know, enlightenment, the idea of enlightenment emphasized more on thinking, rationality, rather than an ontological presence. Right? So the body was not given that much importance in enlightenment thinking. The mind, and that's where mind and body dualism, which was very, very, a serious influence in the 19th century in philosophy, also in the 20th century philosophy, which actually started back from the Descartes' notion of mind-body dualism. Right? I think, therefore, I am is a very famous preposition. Right? So, what about, that's why Lacan later asked, I don't think, therefore I am not. Is that so? So he said that if thinking person is the real I, what about unthinking people? People who cannot think. And that's where this John Locke, in his very famous work, Essay Concerning Human Understanding, says that only who are the rational beings? The rational beings are those who have the ability to think. So people who have mental illness, people who have the condition of, let's say, mentally retarded, cannot be considered as human being, cannot be considered as, in a way, human, according to John Locke. That was again challenged by Disability Studies College and later philosophers, the philosophers, especially postmodern philosophers in the later half of 20th century. Right? So Descartes' notion of I, which is fundamentally rooted on the rationality, on the idea of thinking. I think, therefore I am. If I don't think, I cease to exist. Right? So it goes very clear. It goes very, very, prominently that Descartes did not consider somebody as a human if he or she does not think, if he or she only exists in an ontological way as mere existence. Okay? So, which was once again supported by, as I just said just a while ago, by John Locke in his famous text, Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Once again, a very, very influential text in the movement of enlightenment. Right? If you, somewhere around the same period, always towards the end of, or shall we say, in the second decade of 18th century, you have two important, but very, very popular philosophers, scholars. One is Rousseau, second is Wordsworth. Thinking about the self. Rousseau, in his very famous work, I just told a while ago, that is Confession, vehemently counters the idea of Augustine's Confession. That is, Augustine's notion of self, which is an integral part of divine existence, which is an integral part of spiritual, in a way, spirituality, right? And he says that the self should be a thinking self. Self should be an autonomous self. Self should be above all an individual self. Right? If at all the idea of individual self, which is being in a way spoken of, actually the credit actually goes to Rousseau, who took substance from his predecessors like Descartes and Locke, right? So he says that unlike the idea of self foregrounded by Augustine, the self in the view of Rousseau is autonomous, individual, above all rational, because rationality is the binding idea of enlightenment, right? So, and that was seen as a very, very radical shift, because like if you very clearly, if you could go through Rousseau's confession, he very clearly says why he wants to write the book and what he wants to convey through writing the book, because his book was a very, very important, in a way, a very significant intervention to the study of self, and somebody who, did not believe in the divine attribution, who did not believe in the power of divinity, instead juxtaposed or rather foregrounded his notion of self, which is primarily rooted in the idea of individuality. So what is that individuality? The individuality to Rousseau is something impinged upon the idea of thinking, impinged upon the idea of freedom, impinged upon the idea of a rationality. So this is something, in a way, if you look at it, I'm moving on to the next person, that is Wordsworth, whom all of us are familiar with. His prelude, was almost completed in 1805, but Wordsworth chose to rework on it, chose to edit it, add it, delete something. So he was editing, constantly was editing till his death, 1850. But if you look at Wordsworth otherwise, it wasn't the case. But why? Why Prelude was time and again edited? Why it took 45 years for Wordsworth to, complete Prelude? Probably it is indeed an autobiographical work. That might be one of the reasons. But the reason, if you could look through the perspective of life writing studies, life writing theories, or if you could look Prelude as the, in a way, a continuous work, or as the extension of Rousseau's confession, you'll be able to understand that Wordsworth was not satisfied with his understanding of the self, his understanding of the life itself. Because, as you know, toward the end of 18th century, the French Revolution was taking place, and people like Rousseau's work played a very, very important role in French Revolution. And also goes without saying, Wordsworth was somebody who was radically influenced, heavily influenced by French Revolution, Rousseau's idea of freedom. Right? So, and if you could look at his preface to Lyrical Ballads, he says, I think now I will be able to place that the very famous definition of poetry is not spontaneous, but Wordsworth also says it is an expression of one's own personality, right? His poet is a man speaking to men, right? And more than that, it is an expression of one's own personality. That's an important, in a way, preposition, right? For understanding Wordsworthian notion of self, which was inaugurated by Wordsworth in the dawn of, shall we say, 19th century, right? So when the entire Romanticism, was in a way located by Coleridge, and later the younger Romantic poets like Keats, Shelley, Byron, on the concept of fantasy versus imagination. Here, Wordsworth was somebody conscious of Rousseauian understanding of self, Rousseauian understanding of individuality and freedom, talking about the idea of self, and in a way experimenting with the idea of self or himself. I think that's the right understanding in Prelude, right? So this something continues in the later somewhat 19th century also, but I want you to understand Virginia Woolf and her father, Leslie Stephen. So Leslie Stephen, no doubt, he was also a very, very prolific literature. Somebody who wrote extensively on various subjects. Somebody who also wrote autobiography and the biography of a family. Woolf, in almost in the second decade of 20th century, found her father's writing to be more patriarchal, her father's writing to be phallocentric. Why? Right? So now I am in a way walking you through, the politics, that the inaugural movement of politicization of the self started with Virginia Woolf. Right? So till 20th century, you find self was something, started, if you look at it from the origin of self by Augustine's Confession and the Enlightenment notion of Descartes, Locke, Rousseau, and Wordsworth, somebody who tried to experiment the philosophical influence that he got on the idea of self in literary writing in the first part of 19th century. But now, exactly after 100 years, here comes Virginia Woolf, looking at the self, looking at the literary writing, and dismissing them as a phallocentric piece, which was seen as a much more radical move. Right? I think that was the inaugural period of first wave of feminism, boom of Rousseau. Right? She says, my father, in his own diaries and autobiographies, my mother appears as a mere statue. Why? Because he has tried to, in a way, statuize. He has tried to put Woolf's mother as a statue. As in, he has tried to objectify Woolf's mother in his writings, which was not welcomed by Woolf. Though she learned the art of writing, she learned the art of in a way, biography, autobiography, and above all, the idea of self from her own father. She challenged her own father and dismissed his writings as a phallocentric piece because it did not give a room, or his writings did not give an agency to Woolf's mother. And he says that if that is the case, what expectation I can have for my own, in a way, representation in Stephen's writings. So later, Woolf actually questioned H.G. Wells and all the other men writers in the 19th century. That's altogether a different thing. But the very interesting part of Woolf's, in a way, encounter with Stephen's writing is, let's start from the whole. Let's start in a way criticizing the familial writings, the history of the family. So Woolf, in her work Reminiscence, also in her autobiographical work, which was in a way once again incomplete till her death, so tries to present, or should I use the word re-present, herself through the lens of her own understanding. In other words, Woolf used autobiography or the genre of life writing as a space to politically articulate her own agency. For Woolf, life writing is nothing but a place to perform one's own identity, a place to express one's own, views. It can be political, it can be social, it can be philosophical, it can be cultural, anything for that matter. Right? But the claiming of this space in the field of literature, you can ask me, we do have women writers in the 19th century, no doubt, but I leave it to you. Look at the representation of women in the women writings. Also look at how those novels, the same period, we all know, Jane Austen wrote better than Walter Scott. Her novels are widely prescribed than Walter Scott, but her novels were in a way quite stereotypically categorized as domestic novels. And I would urge you to recall the inaugural lines of Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. You would be able to understand the performance of patriarchy, right? Or the assertion of patriarchy, or the institutionalization of patriarchy in the women's writing itself, right? So it is in this context. So you find Woolf experimenting the art of writing oneself, thereby claiming a space for herself, which was negated, which was in a way refused in the hitherto produced male narratives, right? So with that, if you could move on to the, in the 1950s, you find once again the post-structuralist movement, which completely dismissed the idea of self. Be it is Derrida, be it is, you also have Uhlenbach's Death of the Author. So in a way, the authorial presence was completely dismissed. this was in a way posing a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of, in a way, this was taking a little bit the autobiography a little bit to the back seat for quite some time, till we witnessed in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in the 1970s, Black writings, Afro-American writings, also the civil rights movement. Okay? So the post-structuralist scholars, they dismissed the unity of the self, because they said, how can you have a Bildungsroman sort of a writing in autobiography? Because as we know, till 1970 or 1980, though, we witnessed stream of consciousness narrative style in the novels, but that wasn't used for autobiography, because autobiography was sanctified with the linear narrations. That is to say, a Bildungsroman sort of a narration till 1970s. In 1970s, you find, and even before that, such a sort of narrative style was, and the resultant construction of the self in the life writings, autobiographies particularly, was challenged by Derrida, because through the deconstructive method. Right? So in the 1970s, in a way, slowly getting into my second phase of my talk, that is, how, the self with such a travel, negotiating with various socio-political, cultural, and economic movement, because I skipped the whole part of 19th century, the second half of 19th century, particularly after Industrial Revolution, how the self was institutionalized, how the self was promoted, and which self was promoted, all these things due to a the paucity of time, right? So the politicization of the self, taking a cue from feminist writings like Virginia Woolf, Simone de Beauvoir, right, and others, emerged in the 1970s quite pronouncedly, through the writings of Afro-Americans and particularly Black people, right? So why? Because as you know, and this is where I'm going to provide a context, till now, till 1970s, if you could look at Woolf's, in a way, revelation of herself, happened through her own realization of the subjugation. Her own realization of the subjugation of female selfhood in the male narratives, right? But in the 1970s, thanks to the what they call it in sociology as new social movements, right? Like you have environmental movement, you have Black movement, you have civil rights movement, you have LGBT movement, you have disability movement, you have refugee movement, in other words, human rights movement. All these movements, though they remained in the activist realm, they fought for their own rights, right? And this is the time when the discourse of human rights was evoked ever before, by many people. So, and the point I'm trying to say, it's a very significant, very significant, in a way, departure, significant understanding. That is, till 1970, whatever was considered as the unity of the self. So, in a way, till 1970, human beings were not categorized, let's say, they were not seen as categorical identities, like, separatist identities like black, race, color, gender, body, caste, class, region, religion, all these things. But in the 1970s, due to the discourse of human rights and the provisions entailed in human rights, people started asserting. The people who hitherto did not realize their subjugation were in a way illuminated, were made aware of their own subjugation. For example, black people were made aware of how they were treated by whites. Right? You have this because there's such a sort of an awareness happened in the activist realm. For example, disabled were made aware of the charity that they were receiving, how they were constantly treated by able-bodied people as somebody who is always in the receiving end of charity, who always, lives with certain amount of sympathy of others. And the LGBT people who were hitherto, told that expressing your own sexual orientation was a sin in religious realm, was a crime in the legal realm. Okay? So, and I can go on talking about also women. In Tamil, people often say, John Pillai Analum An Pillai. So even you find women also talking about such sort of a thing, right? So even if it's a 1 feet person, he is a male, right? And also in the religious realm, you find the Holocaust. Also in Israel, you find the Arabs were sent out of their homeland. The state of Israel was established in 1948, all sorts of things. Right? Also in Sri Lanka, needless to say, how Tamils were treated, how Tamil women were raped. In Vietnam, needless to say, in Kashmir, needless to say, right? So, and these people, who were hitherto subjugated, who were hitherto marginalized, through the provisions entailed in human rights passed by United Nations organizations, UNO, and other international bodies, felt the need to claim their rights. Claim which rights? The lost rights. Right? And that is where the idea of citizenship was actually evoked. If I am a citizen of India, I should be given a voting right. I should be given an accessible voting right. Right? So, all these things, the accessible voting right in India, as you see, happening only in the last 10 years. For the blind person, he had to reveal his choice to his escort and he will vote for him. He will not know whether the guy is voting for the person he said or he is voting for his own person. Right? So now they introduced braille, dots in the EVM machines, and they made it much more accessible. And you can see, if you could recall your memory before 10 years, 15 years, or even 20 years, the ramps were not built for the polling booths. And how come person who is on a wheelchair will maneuver into the room? He will be lifted by somebody. That would be a most shameful movement than letting somebody to actually lift you. It's actually it's a shame for the person who is actually in a way being lifted, right? So such a sort of way a politicization of the subjects, people who were marginalized, the tribes, who were constantly displaced because of developmental projects of the nations, right? So those people started documenting their lives. When they started documenting their lives, they found, literature was the best medium to document it, no doubt, because they can't write a history. Because history, as you know, the E.H. Carr wrote a very famous book, What is History? Again and again carried certain amount of objectivity. Certain amount of objectivity, as in, you need to have archival sources to document your life, document the sufferings that you are undergoing. So they cannot rely on, they can't actually go back to, let's say, a London, a British library and refer to the sources of India. It's not possible. They started relying on their memory. They just started writing plainly of their sufferings, what they witnessed, what kind of suffering that they were actually put through, how they were treated by others, how the nation actually or the country treated them, right? How their fellow beings actually treated them. Right? See, they started writing it. And in the 1980s, such a sort of, let's call it as life accounts or personal accounts, right? In a very, very raw manner, were very, very prolific. There were a number of personal accounts coming from Black, coming from LGBT, coming from disabled, coming from refugees across the globe, right? Coming from Dalits in India, as you can see, the very famous anthology Poison Bread. The 1980s came out. After that, you find a number of Dalit accounts coming. Right? So those accounts were in response to the political movements led by the respective groups, the disability rights movement, Dalit movement, women's movement, environmental movement, in general, what the sociologists would say, new social movements, right? And when all of a sudden the field of literature was witnessing a surge in the life accounts, personal accounts. As you know, the theorization of the self, so far, done, was literally helpless to understand these accounts, was literally helpless to theorize these accounts. For what these accounts are coming, what are they talking about? The privileged dismissed those accounts as propaganda. When Dalit accounts came up in the 1990s, the upper caste people dismissed those accounts as mere propaganda. And somebody said that it's a pain narratives, it's a trauma narratives. We are fed up with the trauma narrative, like that somebody said. Some people, they say. But it was a challenge for life writing scholars to theorize those accounts. How to theorize? So, in a way, any life writing, the fundamental part or the aspect of life writing is the self. Right? So Rousseau's theorization would not help us because that's a very, very generic theorization. Freud's notion of psychoanalytical understanding of the self would not help us. Lacanian psychoanalytical self would not help us. Althusserian notion of ideological self apparatus would not help us. How do we categorize these narratives? And that is where people like Laura Marcuse, right, and others, they started in a way looking at this self, like, and even Julia Kristeva and others, the host of life writing scholars, even Sidonie Smith, Julian Watson, and Thomas G. Causer, right? So the host of life writing scholars, they looked at these narratives. Then they realized there is a politicization of self. As in, the politicization of self is not merely on the ground of gender. It is, in a way, it's a third wave feminism. Like women, we don't have feminism, we have feminisms, right? We have Islamic feminism, we have Dalit feminism, you know, we have black feminism, we have disabled feminism, we have queer feminism, even we have transgender feminism. Right? So these, in a way, a theorization were taking place, and they felt that the people, the individuals who were hitherto considered as collective beings, let's say people of India. So who are the people of India? People of India includes Dalits. People of India includes disabled, who are marginalized of the marginalized. People of India includes transgenders. Right? So they need to go to the court and get, and the court had to instruct the government to vaccinate transgender people. Very recently we saw it on the newspaper. Right? Even the small thing like vaccination itself requires much more legal intervention for transgender people. Right? So, in a way, that sort of, so they felt that it is not the collective, the collective national self which is getting articulated. It is the community, the oppressed community. They're coming together and they are fighting for their own rights. And that is where we find disabled life narratives, Dalit life narratives, transgender life narratives, LGBT life narratives, coming up. But now, that is to say, don't we have individual life narratives, individual autobiographies today? We do have individual autobiographies. For example, you have Yuvraj Singh has written individual autobiography. You have Tendulkar autobiography. It's coming up. The celebrity accounts are coming up. But it is no more a celebration for marginalized people. It is the articulation of the collective identity. It is the articulation of collective experience. Right? And such a self, which is coming out of the autobiography. You look at the title, you think of any Dalit autobiography, you think of any disabled autobiography. Either it is based on their own subject position, like being disabled, being Dalit, being LGBTQIA+, or let's say being Black. And look at other titles, the celebrity ones. Those narratives, those accounts mostly center on celebrating individuals, but these accounts center on documenting the community, center on expressing the experience of the community, or what they call it as certain amount of sad experience. Right? So with that, I will, now I'm actually moving on to the third important thing. I don't want to list out the autobiographies. I just, my talk, the intention of my talk today is to just theorize the journey of the self, how the genre of life autobiography, or the canon of autobiography itself, changed into a certain mode of life narratives. Because, as I said, the self is no longer there. Now we have life, because people have moved away from self to the life, because for them, their life itself is at stake. Therefore, they don't want to talk about their self, because they feel that by talking about their life, they would be, in a way, able to pull us, express the self, which is, caught in the socio-political and cultural subjugation of the present times, right? So now let's move on to the third phase of my talk, that is, the categories, right? Yeah, so I said, if such a stage is has actually been arrived by these life writings, these life narratives coming from various marginalized quarters. Now, what are the aspects, shall we say, substance on which these narratives actually um, exist? So the first important thing is an experience. If you look at any sort of marginalized accounts, look at Dalit or any marginalized account, even uh, illness narratives, people who have cancer, right? People who have HIV, people who have chronic illness like multiple sclerosis and other muscular disease. They have written their autobiographies. In their autobiography, the experience is a fundamental part of their self. Right? How their self is constituted through experience. Right? And what they in philosophy or in life writing studies, what they call it as an embodiment. How such an experience makes the person who is writing feel his own or her own embodiment. Basically, embodiment is the in a way a phenomenological feeling. Let's say that someone is blind, is getting into the building. How does he feel his experience of getting into the particular building? If someone has a vision, he would look at the architecture of the building. If someone does not have a vision, he would actually go by the staircase. He would go by certain voice, audio, tactile, right? So those things are there, right? So someone who is on a wheelchair, right? So like that, also someone is Dalit. So he would go by the kind of stigma, the kind of stereotypical understanding, the kind of discrimination one actually feels in the in the workspace, in the society, in the ceremony, social ceremonies, family, the other families that actually he or she visits. Right? So experience. And another important, so that plays a very, very vital role. Another important thing is memory. Right? So memory is something which is an integral part of life writing. One actually relies on memory to document his life writing. It is not possible for somebody to directly write something because he relies on the memory. Some people say the memory is false. Some people say the memory is true. But we are not in the position to verify the memory. The memory is not verifiable because it's a property of an individual. It's a property of an individual because he or she only knows what he narrates is a truthful account or false account or fabricated account or in a way a certain amount of a diluted account. He or she only knows. But nonetheless, these subjects, that is Dalit and other marginalized subjects, heavily rely on memory. The memory is a shared memory, a collective memory. For example, if you read any Palestinian autobiography, you always find that they go back to 1948, what they call it as Al-Nakba, a catastrophe, the year in which they lost their homeland. Right? You read, any disabled account, for example, any blind account, they always talk about their experience of, in a way, losing eyesight, the experience of living with certain amount of thing, living with blindness. You read any cancer accounts, right? They always go back to the pre-diagnostic period, how they led the happy life, and after this diagnosis, what kind of bodily changes that they feel, right? Even transgender accounts, they always talk about their family, how their family treated them, right? So like that, there are certain common, in a way, elements, common experience that invariably you find in all the marginalized accounts, right? So that experience, which is rendered in, which is embedded in the form of memory, what we call it as a collective memory, right? When it is articulated in the life narratives, it constitutes what we call it as a collective identity, right? Collective identity. Collective experience to collective memory, and collective memory to collective identity when it is articulated in the life writings. Also, the idea of space, you can find, space is something what they occupy. If you find Dalit autobiographies, the space is different. The kind of space that they're talking about, space as in where do they live and where they are forced to live. Also, if you find LGBT autobiographies, they have their own idea of space. Right? So, to conclude, what I actually want to say is the traveling of the self, which actually we traced from Augustine till, let's say, 1970, was almost a plain sort of a journey. In the 1970s or after, particularly in the 1980s and 90s, we find, a surge in the life narratives coming from various modernized quarters. Right? And as a how did they come? They came as a result of activist movements, political movements, right? As a response, as or shall we say, to document their sufferings, right? And by doing so, what they actually used, they used their experience. And how did they get their experience? Through memory, and the memory in turn constituted a collective identity. So, so with that, I stop my lecture here. So if there's any question, we'll actually take it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhupati, for elaborating on the journey that has taken over this autobiography, then shifting to life narrative, and how it is being done and how it is being perceived by different sections and different groups. So how they are coming out with their own accounts. So a lot of things you have highlighted. You have touched major parts of life narrative and how it can be effective and how it is, how it is changing the scenario of literary scenario. You said it is a canon that is being formulated. So many ideas you have given. So I hope there would be a lot of questions, a lot of clarifications from participant side. Please, is there anybody who would like to things clarified from Professor Bhupati?
Sir, this is Tyagarajan from Tyagaraja College. So I am really happy to attend this program because the coverage is so wide, and you covered starting from Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Derrida, Sigmund Freud. Almost you covered everything. Really happy. But I have a question. When they write life narrative, when I read some of their writings, I understand that sometimes they exaggerate things, forgetting some normality. And what is your opinion, sir?
Okay, so you mean to say that I want to ask, like, they exaggerate in some of the life writings, and how do I look at it?
Yes, yes, they exaggerate to get attention of other people or to become popular. Now, when they write what is already existing, sometimes it may not become popular. But when you write something or when you magnify something, it may become popular, I feel there are some writers they do it. This is my personal opinion, but what is your opinion about that?
Yes, sir. So thank you for the question. So, sir, actually, the thing is, we are not actually, obviously, some of them, we don't know like whether how much they exaggerate and everything because we are not a party to, to have seen how much they suffer and all, right? For example, Dalit people, they're talking about caste oppression, how they were humiliated, in their childhood. So, but as me, somebody who was reading the autobiography, so when I look at it, I feel like such a suffering is taking place even in the 21st century. Such a caste violation is taking place even in the 21st century. Right? So we ask like this, but the thing is that is the reality. Even today, we get to see a lot of things on the newspaper. Right? That is the thing, sir. I mean, like they obviously exaggerate certain things you say, but to what extent they are exaggerating, we are not actually in a position to number one judge it. That's why I say they're relying on the memory, and we go by what actually been written, right? So, but we cannot dismiss their accounts by saying that it's a mere exaggeration. Because a disabled person, or even Dalit, or even LGBT people, or even transgender people, or even anybody who is exaggerating. Right? But again, like from how are we looking at those accounts? That's a very important thing. The same thing comes up in the newspaper. We don't ask a question. The reporter has exaggerated something written by somebody who actually, in a way, experienced that sort of a violence. Right? But again, so again, it's actually up to the individuals to take position on it because no one can really comment on how much they are exaggerating, or they are exaggerating at all because we have not witnessed, we have not experienced their suffering. Because let's say that my friend is writing an autobiography, and I am a party to it because I know him personally. If I go through it, if I go through the autobiography, if I find that this fellow has written in a very very exaggerated manner because he did not face this sort of problem, then I can say this because I can say it confidently because I have witnessed his life. But other person, let's say somebody writing from Uttar Pradesh, I did not see the person. I did not read anything about the person. If I say the person is exaggerating, but I can't say this. We can't say actually because we are not a party to the person who is actually suffering. So that's what I have to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Thank you.
raised this question because
Okay. Sir.
when the writer Bama writes about where she resided for schooling and other things,
Mm-hmm.
she criticizes or she finds fault with the missionary run by Christians.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing very well that Christian missionaries always follow certain rules and regulations very strictly, but she says in some occasions that their attitude is something different, something unacceptable like that. That is why I raised this question. So when they represent a particular class,
Mm-hmm.
can they write like this? This is my another thing. You said that only when we witness we can say. When we read newspapers, people write. When something written by writers from other states, we may not know.
Mm-hmm.
But since we are in Tamil Nadu and when we find fault with Christianity and we know something about Christian missionaries, the idea came to my mind is there may be a little bit exaggeration. I don't find fault with that. It will be there, but I think it is not necessary to exaggerate the instance. That is why I wanted to find out.
No,
That is
actually,
the
sir, it is obviously it is not necessary for anybody to exaggerate, particularly for the marginalized people, because for their life itself is like that. They don't have to exaggerate. If they talk about their own life, it will many pages will be filled. Right? They don't have to exaggerate anything. But again, what is happening in the Christian missionary school and all these things, we don't know. For example, till the very popular public school from Chennai, when the female students came out on Twitter and said that they were sexually harassed, we all we all knew that, like the school was fine and all these things, right? We didn't question anything. Even then also, even students, 10 students said it. Then also, till the teacher said that he did it, many people did not believe it. And the perpetrator himself said it that I did it. Then only people started believing it. So that's what I'm saying. It is all personal. I mean, it's all personal, as in deeply personal. How much the person is suffering, how much the experience he is having, and how the person is, how somebody is actually stigmatizing them. We can't actually measure it. That's what I'm saying. But there's a thin. I completely agree with you. There's a thin line of demarcation between what is real and what is unreal. That line only is known to the person who is writing.
Right.
But we need to, in a way, look at, but we can't deny the fact that the caste oppression is there even today. We still see a lot of honor killing taking place. We still see dual graveyard in many villages for Dalit and others. We still, see this dual teacup system prevailing in the villages. So we, we think that those things have vanished, but those things are still there.
Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for raising. People would have wanted to ask. Is there any question from participant side? Or anybody wants to?
Sir?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, sir. I am Anusha Hegde, PhD first year student from Central University of Punjab. Sir, the talk was very, very, very nice. I just had one question. So when we look at getting some objective information about some objective events which has happened, which can be seen as something that has happened in the past. And especially when we are looking for information about that event or that situation from subjective accounts of people, when they are narrating the self experience or what their self was going through. So in the present scenario, we see that many of the many such scenarios happen where research scholars or any researcher, they are stuck between trying to assert something as real or or we should just negate everything as unreal, as completely subjective, nothing is objective. So such kind of discussions are coming because of the after the negation of everything phenomena started from the post-structuralist vein. So yeah, sir. So my question is, can we draw a line where we can say that yes, this is real and this is unreal, as you were saying in the previous question also? Can we make out, and if so, how can we make such things out, sir? Like, if any example.
Right. Good. Yeah. See, let me tell you a couple of things. The first thing is, the first thing is between real and unreal. And as you know, if you have heard the term, we are living in the age of post-truth, post-truth, after truth. There's nothing is truth. I would say, except the fact, truth is something, I always say it in my class also, mutually constructed. It's a mutual agreement between you and I. Let's say that I'm asking, why did you come late to the class? Somebody is saying that, sir, I had some other work, this thing, that thing. If I believe it, it becomes the truth. If I don't believe it, it becomes false. It's just a matter of some truth, whatever you assert, it will not become the truth unless other person believes it, unless other person agrees to it, number one. Number two, yes, there are common objectives, there are common objective incidents, but please understand, life narrative or life account is only an interpretation of somebody of the common incident. Let's say that we have a lot of partisan narratives. Right? Mando says in his writings that women were abducted and raped by his own community people. That is his interpretation. Somebody says that women were abducted, Muslim women were abducted by Hindu and they were raped by Hindu men. That is their own interpretation. So it's basically the same incident, how it is interpreted by somebody. As we know, when we look at the idea of hermeneutics, right? So from which perspective you are looking at it, right? So let's say if I give you a text, if you are a feminist, you will look at it from a feminist perspective. If you are a disability studies scholar, you look at how the disabled is portrayed in the same text. If you are, let's say, somebody who is a sociologist, you look at it in a certain manner, right? But the thing is, all the perspectives, that is an advantage you can perhaps say in being in the field of literature, but anything is an interpretation. Life narrative is also an interpretation of oneself, right? Because as we know, Derrida also says, language is a poor substitute to express ourselves, right? So what we are feeling inside, when we put it in the words, only 50 to 60% we are actually able to articulate. Another 40% we are not able to articulate. And most of the time, we are, rather than being well understood, we are being misunderstood, right? So the thing is, how, in a way, what is real, what is unreal? This is the perennial question, particularly in the era of post-truth. Somebody says, write something, somebody will spread the news and say that these things have happened. If, let's say that 1 lakh people started tweeting the same thing on Twitter, it becomes a news. And somebody comes and says that it's a false, with an evidence. That's a post-truth, right? So unless or until you have an evidence for something, anything is actually, whatever you claim as a truth, it's merely an abstract, and whatever is abstract, it is merely dependent upon other person to agree it. If the person agrees it, it becomes truth. If he doesn't agree, it becomes false. Truth, therefore, is a mutual construction. Real, what is, again, the idea of real also in post-structuralist. But now, let me tell you. So, post-structuralism rejected all the identities. It did not actually, construct or constitute or validate any sort of identity. It rejected all the identities. Now the question is, these people who are using the postmodern meta-narratives, right? There is no feminism. There is nothing called the feminism. There are feminisms. When you say the feminism, it's a grand narrative. There are feminism when you say it's actually meta-narratives. So obviously, yes, not all women are same. Dalit women are more oppressed than mainstream women. Muslim women, they are more oppressed than, let's say, white women or Hindu women. Right? So the idea of the plurality of identities or heterogeneous identities. That is where in cultural studies also Adorno, even Appadurai, a lot of people, they argue we don't have a homogeneous identity. We should always understand that our identity is heterogeneous. Right? In that sense, what is actually, that is why Indian is almost problematic, because many people do not agree to it. For example, even in the post-colonial thing itself, there used to be 1980s, 70s, and 90s. People started talking about Homi K. Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, and they said that the colonized and colonizer. They looked at the subject position in two different dichotomy. After that, when post-colonialism was almost fading away, they started using the term subaltern. Now, Dalits have a problem with subaltern. What do you mean by subaltern? Subaltern is nothing but a class identity. Ours is a caste identity. Disables, they don't want to be called a subaltern. So now the subaltern has also gone. Now we are living in the age of post-subaltern identities, where individual groups have their own identities. Individual groups have their own epistemology, their own knowledge, and we need to look at their knowledge. Whether it is real, whether it is unreal, we are not a party to judge it, because the person, as I said in response to the previous question also, there is a thin line between real and unreal, truth and false, right? Abstract and reified. So there's a thin line, and that line is only known to the person who is writing it. I guess this has answered your question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anusha ma'am and sir for asking question and also elaborating. Participants, you can ask question if you have. And professors, research scholars, you are invited to ask question if you have.
Hello, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Sir, shall I ask a question, sir? Sir,
Yeah, please.
sir, I'm
please.
Pongadi from Masaram. We always know whenever the scholars they take all these life narratives, they are always asked to use the theories and something different always. Sir, any contemporary theories that they can apply or cross-refer to read all these life narratives? So all the gender theory, like we have that thing. We need a theory to substantiate our views. So any contemporary theories, sir?
Yeah, there's actually, I mean, contemporary theories, as in like you can refer to. There's a book by Thomas D. Kauser titled Memoir. You can understand, go through it. He talks about various types of memoir. There's another book by Sidonie Smith and Julian Watson. Title of the book is Reading Autobiography: Guides for Interpreting Life Narratives. You can refer to the second edition, where they're talking extensively about the idea of autobiography. And also you have Linda Anderson's very popular one, Autobiography. It is a part of New Critical Idiom series by Routledge, published in 2001. These three books you can actually refer to. There are a lot of many, but to start with, I think this will help.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Is there anybody going to ask question? If no one is ready, then we can put an end to this question session and go to the concluding part of this wonderful webinar. Is there any question in the chat box, Kavipriya ma'am?
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay. The feedback link is also given. The participants, who have participated from the beginning till now can fill it up and submit as soon as possible. Okay, I think this is the brilliant and what I would say extraordinary seminar that we had. I hope all the participants and others would agree with me, because he has highlighted different forms of life narrative and how they are coming up and how they are being viewed and how we can understand. That is very important. Even before I could start this seminar, I had a lot of doubts. Many know how the post-truth is operating and what are the problems we have concerning this life narrative, how that can be clarified and all. He has highlighted from Augustine till the 21st century. Dr. Bhubadi has given a comprehensive view how postmodern and post-structuralist thoughts must be taken into account to understand this genre called the life narrative. In fact, there are groups and individualized groups are there, and they have got their own truth, and they produce those truth in the form of their own narrative style. This is what we have understood. So thank you so much, Bhubadi sir, for clarifying and elaborating and extending the autobiography, and what we knew before your speech is different from what we have learned. The autobiography cannot be the one which simply records the life of a particular person, but it is a problematic one. It is it has to be accepted. We have to accept, and we have to feel with the person who is writing the autobiography, because they record their sufferings, they record their experience. So even more sensitively we will approach the life writings hereafter. All groups like Dalits, disabled and women, all sufferers, they have got their space in the form of a life narrative. That is what you have highlighted. So thank you so much. I don't know if I say a simple thanks, that wouldn't be enough to convey what I feel and what others would like to convey to you. Thank you, Dr. Bhubadi sir, for giving such a wonderful lecture. Formally, I invite Mrs. Subhashini ma'am to deliver vote of thanks. Subhashini ma'am.
Thank you, Magendran sir. So, on the behalf of Department of English, Tyagaraja College, it's a great honor and my privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this memorable occasion. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude and respect to our distinguished resource person and speaker of the day, Dr. B. Bhupati, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Central University of Thiruvarur. From individual self to collective identity, reflections on the contemporary forms of lives and narratives. Sir, it was an impressive and interactive presentation that gave a different perspectives of life narratives to the participants on this topic. Once again, thank you, sir. I am extremely grateful to our respected secretary and correspondent for his constant encouragement and support for conducting this event. I also express my sincere gratitude to our Reverend Principal, Coordinator of IQSC for the able guidance they have extended to all of us in our department. I am very much thankful to our head of our department, Dr. Tyagarajan sir, for his unselfish support and his guidance in conducting this webinar in a vibrant manner. Above and beyond, let us not forget the backbone of this webinar, and I owe my special gratitude to my department colleagues organizing members for lending their helping hands and their support to ensure the occasion becomes a memorable success. Last but not least, I thank all the delegates who are all connected here in virtual mode for their unconditional cooperation by retaining till end in making this event a resounding success. Thank you all. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Subhashini ma'am, for highlighting all important aspects of this virtual seminar that we had. And I should also express my gratitude to my department, Tyagaraja College English department, for providing all the support. Without their cooperation, this wouldn't have happened. Technically, they were there to prepare this Google form and all to make this event a grand success. Virtually, we had a memorable time. The seminars that we had and the back to work seminars we had, made us learn a lot of things. So finally, I conclude with a happy and memorable feel. Thank you everyone. Thank you so much.